His name is synonymous with heritage roses around the world. I thought at first this man does not need an introduction, but then I met a few people who didn't know him. So I'll give you an outline. He's a founding member of the Heritage Rose Foundation and developer of their extraordinary journal, Rosa Mundi. And if you don't have a copy or you haven't ever bought one, please do. You will be absolutely inspired. He's a gifted writer and a world lecturer on heritage roses. He has spent more than 30 years passionately collecting an astounding 4,000 rare and old roses that became the largest collection in North America. And I have seen a whole lot of them myself, and they're fabulous. This was the basis of his much inspired and much loved Vintage Gardens nursery that I hope many of you bought roses from, or at least had gone up there to see them. And as a talented garden designer, which I didn't know actually that Gregg did this, he has varied design creations throughout Northern California and the cities of Louisiana, South Carolina, Seattle, and Albuquerque. And who knows where he's going with that skill. Could be a lot more states. Most importantly, Gregg Lowery is gracious, kind, and a remarkable artisan who has generously shared his life's passion wholeheartedly with all of us, and I hope that all of you, like me, have been really inspired by him. So please give a warm welcome to Gregg Lowery.
Thank you all so much for being here today, for being rosarians and rose lovers. They say we're a dying breed. And to test that theory, I want you to do two things for me right now. I want you to look around the room at the empty seats, because in those seats would have been sitting people you knew who loved roses, who grew them, who shared them, who inspired their children with them, who inspired us with them. I think of one person in particular, and while I'm telling you about this person, I want you to think about someone that had that importance in your life with roses and who is not now here with us. My person is a man named Carl Loon. He worked at the University of California at Davis. He was an avid collector of roses, both old and modern, a great gardener, a very, very gentle, kind man who shared his love of roses and all of his talents and abilities and free time with the world of roses. And one of the things and one of the gifts that Carl gave back to the world of roses, a gift that will go on for a long time, and a gift that if it had not been given by Carl, would now be an absence in our lives. What Carl did was he worked with the Plants Material Services at Davis who de-virus, who remove mosaic virus from roses. And he encouraged that entity within the UC system to include as many roses as possible. Not just those roses that were currently popular in commerce, but other roses that perhaps were the least popular, but still worthy roses. Because of Carl's work, that collection at UC Davis is twice what it would be. A very valuable resource for the world of roses. The second thing I want you to do is to look around the room and put your eyes on someone that you know now, that you love, who has inspired you with roses. We will all be gone. We will all go extinct. So when, well, I might be the first. But when people say, you know, we're a dying breed, yes, we're human, we are mortal, we are dying. Our passion, our interest, our profession of obsessions in life will be a different thing for generations to come. Each one of us is a precious rose. Each one of us. It is not by accident that so many roses that have been introduced for so many hundreds and hundreds of years bear the names of people, of real people who lived, who loved, and who either were inspired by roses or inspired those who were inspired by roses to make more, to create more of the beauty of roses for the world. This gift, this extraordinary connection with roses and their blossoming, their exploding in the world, is something that will pass down to the next generation of rosarians, of gardeners, maybe of engineers and scientists, who knows. But so many roses have been born to the world, and roses only go extinct when we allow them to. If a person who loved roses is important to you, you do something to remember that person. But roses are equally valuable because one rose touches so many hearts. I want to tell you a story about a crazy collector of roses. We're all that in our hearts. Some of us, unfortunately, have the space to do it and started early enough in life that we could actually get ourselves into really big trouble with roses, and that would be me. A beautiful rose garden is like nothing in the world. Absolutely nothing. Doesn't matter whether it's old or modern roses, doesn't matter if it's crisp and clean and uniform and regimented and perfectly manicured, or busy and sloppy and overgrown, like parts of mine. My garden is the result of a lifetime of passion for roses. My grandmother got me gardening at the age of 4, and at the age of 13, my parents bought a house that had belonged to someone else before, and that someone loved roses and had a rose garden in the front of the house. My parents didn't really particularly care about plants, gardens, or roses, but my grandmother had passed that on to me, and I said, "Can I be the rose gardener?" From that time, the age of 13 to now, and on Monday I will be 64. So a long time with roses in my life, and roses being important to me. The result of all of that was the creation of a huge collection of roses, which I shared for many years with Philip Robinson, who many of you know, who is one of the great knowledgeable rose people in the world. The two of us merged collections and set our sights on creating a fantastic garden of roses. We loved old roses. We loved modern roses too. I am particularly eclectic, and so although people think of me as, an old rosarian, well, I'm old rosarian. They may not realize that I grow a lot of things that were introduced last year as well. Who could resist a beautiful rose? Oops, I did something. That's let's go back and yes, next one. That's where we're going. Thank you. I grew up in California for most of my life, although I was raised in the Midwest. That's where I lived with my grandmother and got the garden bug. But California has come to be the place that I have learned to garden and where I take my starting point with roses. I can't do more than, people ask me to consult on how to grow roses in New Orleans or on Long Island, and I just frankly say to them, you need to talk to someone who actually lives here and knows what it is to do the gardening. We know California because we live here, and we know a great deal about it, but sometimes we forget things. Right now, we're really aware that we we have an 8 to 10 month dry season in California, depending upon how much rain we're getting. Right now, it's, for parts of the states, it's like, 2 weeks of rain, and the rest of the year totally dry. We have to irrigate. We have to grow roses under very different conditions, but we're also blessed by this superb dry air, and also in coastal areas by the wonderful marine influence that often makes roses particularly beautiful, as it does in places like Marin County. Often makes roses look horrible, as it does in Sebastopol in the gloom of June, when the fog never goes away. And the one thing that I think many of us have encountered and dealt with are pocket gophers. You don't really have any idea how many pocket gophers live in this state. And how much they love only certain roses. Well, it's about 99% of them. But if I could write a book, it would be the roses that gophers do not eat, and that would be the Bible for California rose gardeners. One quick anecdote: wonderful documentary was done on the reforestation of Mount St. Helens after the great explosion of the mountain. And one of the things that naturalists did was they flew over the miles of fields of lava, of pumice left behind, looking for signs of life. And after many months of doing this, they couldn't actually go down and land because it was just, they would have gone deep into the dust. But within about 6 months' time, they began from their helicopters to spot little tiny pinpoints of green. And this pepper grew and grew and grew. And finally, when they were able to get down some months later, after actually green had returned to much of the surface, what they found was that pocket gophers, who had been buried 14 feet in the soil underneath the lava flow, had burrowed up through the pumice to the surface. When they reached the surface, they didn't actually, take along a shopping bag and bring, hoist seeds up with them. But in their fur came both soil and seeds. And those tiny little, prizes were responsible for the regreening of that area. It's a reminder to all of us that the pests that we hate the most probably are the most important creatures on Earth from one perspective or another. I have my bad thoughts too. And you'll get to see that in a minute. So at the age of 13, this rose garden that was in the front of the house my parents purchased in Castro Valley was a mess. It was a great example of what people were doing in the late 50s in planting rose gardens. It was a square of soil with hybrid teas, a lovely white lattice arbor behind with a climbing rose on it, and the ground was covered with black plastic and white rock. Well, anyone who's ever gardened that way, after a few years, you kind of get the point, well, first of all, the rain doesn't get down to the soil through solid black plastic. And white rock doesn't have very many nutrients that it actually puts into the soil, and roses need more than just fertilizer. They actually need a healthy soil. But to me, it was glorious. Here was this fabulous square of brilliant white rocks and these wonderful rose plants, albeit in very poor condition. I had no idea what to do with them. I didn't have a pair of secateurs. I weeded. That's what I knew what to do. I couldn't take the lawnmower over the white rocks. And the rest of the time, I just admired the roses and let them do their thing. And in this 24 or so hybrid tea roses that grew in that garden, I kept coming back to one rose, a rose that each time it bloomed seemed to have a different blend of colors that could range from a wonderful kind of apricot, buffy yellow with red edges to something that was this wonderful sort of soft oxblood red veined with orange and yellow. And that rose, as I found out many, many, many years later, was the rose Talisman. At the time, I didn't even know roses had names. But for me, it was a fabulous revelation all those years later in my life when I was in my 30s and I came across a plant of Talisman and I said, that's the rose that I admired at the age of 13. They become, they kind of become a part of your heart or your microphone. In my late graduate student days when I was at UC Berkeley getting my teacher's credential, I moved into a little house, a little cottage, a little craftsman cottage that belonged to the famous Alice Waters of Chez Panisse. And I rented it from her. And in the front of that house was a little planting of roses. I suspect Helen Trauble was one of them. I know that Sutter's Gold was the major feature, just the shrub planted up against the porch that had grown 4 or 5 feet above the porch and just bloomed and bloomed and bloomed, and so incredibly fragrant. I was determined that I was going to do something to upgrade that garden because it hadn't been weeded or taken care of for years. And so I went. I didn't know exactly what to do with the roses, what was the best thing to do, so I thought, well, the first thing you do is you go to the nursery and you buy a book, and I did. I bought what turns out to be the Ortho Book of Roses. This would be 1975. And in that book, for the first time, Ortho had this chapter on the history of the historical roses. It was written and researched by Phil Edinger and with the assistance of John McGregor. And in it were photographs of roses that absolutely mesmerized me. So I didn't know that a Talisman rose was any different from Variegata di Bologna. I just knew that they looked really, really different. And I'd seen a lot of roses that looked like Talisman, but I had never seen a rose that looked like Mabel Morrison or Ypsilanti. That turned on my auto obsession for old roses. From there on, I was hooked and have never backed off of it. I wanted to grow those roses. Where do you buy them? And so at the time, there were only 2 or 3 nurseries in the United States that offered a selection of old roses, and most notably Roses of Yesterday and Today down in Watsonville, who had a wonderful, wonderful catalog, the Will Tillotson catalog. And so I bought roses from Roses of Yesterday and Today. And immediately on receiving my first roses and planting them, my first own choices of roses to grow because I wanted to grow them and try them, I immediately joined the Heritage Roses group, which was started by Miriam Wilkins and Barbara Worrell, and became really a worldwide phenomenon. It inspired groups in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Now, and that influence has spread finally in recent years into Europe. And there is a tidal wave of interest and groups surrounding old roses in France, which is phenomenal because the French really resisted any interest in old roses, even though most of them came from France. Barbara Worrell and Miriam Wilkins were great, great, great inspirations for me, as was a book by Nancy Steen, a New Zealander, who grew old roses that she collected from the waysides of New Zealand, as well as from nurseries that were bringing in interesting old roses and offering interesting old roses. If you've never read this book, but you do have a sort of soft spot for roses and the idea of rose rustling, she was the original, and she's the best, and she's a delightful read. It has been reprinted in recent years, but it is out of print currently, but available online. I also began to discover that there were other people out there growing old roses, and my greatest inspiration was Joyce DeMitz. Joyce and her sister Virginia Hopper had a rose nursery up in Mendocino, and they grew roses from cuttings on their own roots and shipped them all over the country. Joyce and Virginia preceded my development of a nursery by maybe 15 years or so in their own nursery. And when the day came that I opened our first retail nursery, Joyce and Virginia had come down for 3 weeks solid to help me paint the building and work to make the nursery as pretty as it could be. That's the spirit that you find among rose lovers. It doesn't matter if you're in business. The competition has to be there, but it can be gentlemanly and supportive. So ensued then, after the little cottage in Berkeley, when Alice, after I left, complained that I had planted these things that she didn't recognize as roses. I did change her mind about that later on. We gathered roses from many sources, and some that I think are of particular interest to me now include Joseph Kern's nursery, which disappeared. He was in, I believe it was Mentor, Ohio. Kern grew both modern and old roses, but had a wonderful selection of old roses. And we bought many things from him that have turned out to be great, great treasures, which I'll show you shortly. Philip and I were also inspired by a close friend, George Matson, who was a professional gardener and grew roses in some really very famous houses in Santa Rosa, including Mableton. George was a fabulous guy who simply inspired everybody. And he began Philip on Philip's journey of collecting old roses and subsequently restoring the old rose garden at the Corbell Winery, which many of you got to visit. It was more than a rose garden. It was a garden of passion and beauty of all forms. Taught an awful lot about how you can use both old and modern roses with other plants. We collected tea roses in the Gold Country and Pernettiana hybrid teas in Santa Rosa, which was a place where many roses were grown in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Still surviving at that time. Now most of them gone. Most of them collected from the front gardens of people whom we met and talked to. The Huntington Gardens was a really important early link for us and connection for us, because the Huntington had a collection of historic roses and was actively developing programs for those interested in heritage roses to come and learn from the garden about old roses and to be able to actually see things growing under superb conditions. We brought a large number of roses from our collection to the Huntington in the early 1980s, and that became a permanent part of their collection. And in return, we gathered cuttings from things that they had in their collection that perhaps at the time were of the least interest to anybody, and that was the old hybrid tea collection, which is, if you've ever seen it, is one of the most extraordinary collections of roses, hybrid teas introduced from the early 1900s through the 1950s and 60s. And it's beautifully displayed and laid out in a way that one can actually learn something about this circle of roses. I hate to look at it as a timeline because I really do see over and over again, the more I read about people's reasons for hybridizing roses, the more I find that actually it's certain objectives, certain things that breeders find absolutely breathtaking that they want to try to recreate. And those are inspired from the past. And so we have waves of small cluster-flowered roses of all sizes being on the ascendant, to they're going out of fashion, and the large flowered rose coming back in again. So for me, it's not so much a timeline, although history is critical, but it is a circle. We're constantly turning in a circle. Among the beginnings of the Heritage Roses group and the Heritage Rose Foundation, of which I was a founding member, and have been behind their concept of preservation from the beginning. That is what has informed and inspired everything I have done, is that we do need to preserve things. We can't simply let them go by the way. And then Philip and I had gathered roses through importing from all over the world, and most notably from a wonderful small Danish nursery who had access to fabulous collections of old roses throughout Europe. That was brief-lived, and the Lickas, now the nursery has started back up again, but it's been some 15 years or 20 years since they really had much to offer. This rose, the Viscountess of Kern, to me is the epitome of the importance of a rose's name. We received this from Joseph Kern as the Viscountess Folkestone, but it is not. We've been able to compare that with known plants of the Viscountess Folkestone from many sources. And this is similar but not the same. And it's not even so similar. But what it is something far more garden-worthy in California than Viscountess Folkestone. This rose in my garden has always bloomed like this from the beginning of May until the end of December, making just the most beautiful displays and being as disease-free as any hybrid tea could be. From what I have been able to study about this rose in terms of its physical characteristics, to me it is a rose that would have been introduced at the end of the 19th century. It's incredibly fragrant, but we don't know its name. We've given it a name. It's not the Viscountess Folkestone, it's Viscountess of Kern, the people who sold it to us. Philip Robinson was an amazing, had a great eye for finding roses. And he and I went many, many places finding things. We found Miriam Wilkins up in the top at the Santa Rosa Rural Cemetery, growing out of a grave. We thought that it was actually a seedling of an old hybrid perpetual that had seeded in the cemetery and grown on someone's grave. Some years later, we've discovered that it actually does correspond to a hybrid perpetual introduced in France in the 19th century. It's very, very fragrant. We named it in honor of Miriam. I will always call it Miriam Wilkins, and the other name it has, it's like cats, you know. Cats have many names, and roses do too. The Angel's Camp tea, one of the great treasures of the gold country. This old Pernettiana rose, which we call the old Corbel Gold, which was growing at the Corbel house garden. The 2nd Street tea, which came from 2nd Street in Santa Rosa. One of the most beautiful teas I've ever grown. And with all my communication with people around the world, a tea rose that no one else seems to have in their collections. It doesn't correspond to anything that we know in other collections. Oh, and one last thing, Souvenir de Claudius Pernay. Philip and I were constantly on the lookout for houses that were about to be torn down. On Santa Rosa Avenue, south of Santa Rosa in those days, there were still lots of little farmhouses and little cottages along that long stretch of the highway, of the road. And so every month a new house was coming down, and we targeted any house that was about to be demolished. And there would be a sign up, public sign saying demolition. And we would simply walk on the property and go all through the garden and collect cuttings from anything that was there, in the hopes that if it was a treasure, if it wasn't known elsewhere, it had a chance to survive and continue. And one of the roses that we collected was Souvenir de Claudius Pernay. We were almost certain the moment we saw it that it was Souvenir de Claudius Pernay. We took a few cuttings. We came back the next day deciding this is Claudius Pernay, Souvenir de Claudius Pernay being the first yellow, truly yellow hybrid rose that is called a hybrid tea that actually looks like a hybrid tea. So for those who wanted the hybrid tea form, it was the first opportunity for that wonderful golden yellow, an almost unfading gold. The next day we went back and the house was gone. The ground had been scraped. We knew exactly where the Claudius Pernay was. We dug up the roots, and that survived as well. Other great treasures that we found and imported, the Alliance Franco-Russe, which is a beautiful sort of buffy yellow tea rose, and the Kern White Hybrid Perpetual, which we've been able to determine is the original Margaret Dixon. Very important rose in modern rose breeding and an ancestor of peace. George Matson maintained this garden around this wonderful old mansion in Santa Rosa. This is what it looked like at the time he began working there. It was then restored. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I was asked to come. George had died, and I was asked to come in and to help to redesign the rose garden and other sections of the garden. The house, meanwhile, was being fully restored to its original condition. And a mansion of this size, you can imagine how many Silicon Valley dollars that cost. Sad to say, the current owners don't really like roses or flowers particularly, but it is a status symbol for them, so the rose garden continues to be quite beautiful. And in that garden, there were originally growing these 3 roses, Fortune's Double Yellow, an old once blooming climbing rose from China, Agrippina, which is a sort of dwarf form of Cramoisie superior, one of the early China roses brought in from the Orient, from China. And then this mystery rose, this little miniature rose, which on first sight we thought corresponded to the rose called Rouletti. Rouletti being this miniature rose bred in the 18th, early 19th century that disappeared entirely from gardens and then was rediscovered at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century in a window box in a Swiss village. A name for Captain Roulette, or Roulet, who was the finder of this rose. So we subsequently offered this to our customers as Rouletti for about 10 years. And on a visit to Ralph Moore, Ralph said to me, I ordered your Rouletti, and I really hate to tell you this, but my mother had one of the first plants of Rouletti brought into this country in 1905. And I still have that, and I'll give you cuttings of it, and you can compare. Far from that being a bad thing, it was a fabulous thing, because I actually then had the real Rouletti with a great provenance behind the story. But we also had a new 1810 probably miniature rose that didn't exist in commerce anywhere. So we've made a great deal of this rose and we've passed it around to many places. What I love is the fact that in little old Santa Rosa, this rose was able to be purchased and planted in this garden. Its name is long gone, and probably we will never know what the name of it is, but it's beautiful, and it's still alive. The Huntington Botanic Gardens, I've talked a little bit about. What I want to say right now is two things. Their collection of early hybrid teas is a must. Secondly, I want to give a big thanks to this man, Tom Carruth. Many of you know him as the breeder of many wonderful introductions. Perhaps, in my opinion, Tom is the greatest rose breeder alive today. He has given us so many amazing gifts. Tom, at the end of his tenure with Weeks Nursery as a rose breeder, humbly took on the job as the curator of the rose garden at the Huntington. A big pay cut for him. And what he has done with that garden would knock your socks off. If you had been there 3 years ago and went there today, you would be amazed at what knowledge, thought, and ability to communicate with people about why a rose garden is important are so critical to our experience of roses. Tom Carruth, I bless you, I kiss you, stay there. So, roses, 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 gathering like a dust ball in my garden, had to go somewhere. In 1986, we purchased this property in Sebastopol, in the country outside Sebastopol. And by the end of 1986, I had this drawing finished. I knew exactly how the garden was going to be designed and laid out and where all these roses were going to go. Well, I was wrong about the last part because many of them still aren't in the garden, but nonetheless, 2.5 acres is not big enough for a collection of 4,000 roses. I'm here to tell you. But it does hold a lot. And as you can see, this garden is partially garden and partially probably the biggest pot ghetto of roses you'll ever encounter. And I have to tell you, this Google photo dates back a few years. And if there's any blank space left here, well, it's all rose pots right now. And that's in part because our nursery has closed. And we worked very, very hard to propagate the rarest roses in our collection so that we could be certain they survived the transition as the nursery left. And so we've brought in about 1,500 to 1,600 roses onto the property since then. Want to make one little observation here. You'll notice that in certain areas it's really green, and in other areas fairly green, and in other areas it's, you can tell the green part is the grass. These are hybrid teas, planted in a very traditional way in beds, 4 plants across. These are old hybrid teas, planted in ranks here and planted as a garden using the oldest of the hybrid teas here. Less green, even less green, lots of green. These are the old roses. These are the 19th century roses, there and there. Why? Because we grow them as shrubs. We can do that with hybrid teas. You can allow a hybrid tea to build up, and if any of you have ever grown Sutter's Gold, you kind of don't have a choice with that rose, It just gets into a big shrub, and that's that. But we've adopted a pattern of of keeping hybrid teas to a certain size. You know, in California they're bigger than they are elsewhere, but they're you know, at least in this range, and that's a lot less biomass than a shrub that gets over your head and weeps down around you, or even a suckering Gallica rose that may not get taller than 3 feet, but that fills every square inch of space with its suckering growth. We need to learn from this example if we're going to actually get roses through the droughts that we're in now and that will be coming in the future. This garden in that year, and this was photographed, well, actually, this is fairly early in April, I can tell from the old rose blooming in the tree up there. But this garden for 2 years received no summer water whatsoever, and we didn't lose any plants in the garden. Even though some of them were fairly weak plants, they somehow survived as well. Roses are deep-rooted. Let them do that. To let them do that, you have to let them build up top mass. But the result will be roses that can go through the droughts. Isn't something that I kind of made up. It's something we discovered as we found roses in old cemeteries and neglected and abandoned gardens. You walk into a cemetery in the gold country on a 95-degree day in August, and you come across a tea rose that's 6 or 8 feet tall and covered with flowers and hasn't seen a drop of water since April. That's a testimony. So figuring out all of these roses was a big part of it. And I won't go on about this part of what I want to talk about except to say that many of the things we found need to be still identified. We still don't know what their original names were. And many things, like Catherine Gislaine, are roses that we know are living under false names. We do know her true name now, which is Selina Dubose. And she is one of the early Portland roses, and a rare one in that she's nearly white. This, by the way, does not exist in our collection now. If you know anybody who's growing this under the name Selina Dubose or Catherine Gislaine, let me know. All of that rose collecting had to be paid for somehow. Ha, ha, ha. What a dumb idea. I don't mean collecting the roses, but thinking that you could actually pay for taking care of that many roses by opening a nursery of roses. Ooh, a lot of people talked me into this. But Vintage Gardens it grew out of this collection. It was the reason for its existence was to provide us with some additional labor so that we could maintain this collection of roses, but also because we were keen on sharing these roses with other people too. And we shared with many, many, many gardens, public gardens particularly, very freely. And the most notable was the San Jose Heritage Rose Garden. And when it was initially created and budwood was taken for it, budwood of 3/4 of our collection was taken and duplicated to put into this collection. So the San Jose Heritage contains sections that are all old hybrid teas or polyantha roses, but there's lots and lots of modern roses as well. If you took out these more modern varieties, virtually all of the rest of that is duplicated in our collection because it came from our collection. And I say that with great honor at having been asked to share these roses, and with great satisfaction that the heritage has inspired so many people to love so many roses. And particularly because we were able to take cuttings of many, many things in that garden before they disappeared. There's been a lot of attrition in that garden. So a part of our collection holds on to a piece of the San Jose heritage that we want to be able to give back to them when they can take it. And then how else do you do it besides money? You do it with friends. You know, you talk your friends into coming over on a Saturday afternoon and helping you garden. Well, actually, these friends grew from customers who came to our nursery and who loved the garden that they got to see during May when I could open it up. But they said, you know, it really could be better weeded. Why don't I come over someday and weed? Oh, no, I don't think you should do that. Bad idea. And this wonderful group of people just emerged out of the shadows, called themselves the Friends of Vintage Gardens, the name of our nursery. And they began showing up, and they helped us to plant about, over a 5-year period, about 1,200 roses in the ground, as well as maintain them and weed them and mulch them. They're an amazing group of people, and they continue to be a source of support. And some friends become very special to you, one of whom is my dearest friend in the world, Pamela Temple, beside a seedling rose. Oops, sorry about that. Wrong button. Beside this seedling rose, which she raised from a rose in her garden, which is kind of hybrid musk-like, and she calls it rosalia, the old Roman term, and she has an open garden every year in her garden up in Mendocino, which she calls rosalia. So it was the rose to commemorate that event. She lives on many acres on a steep slope in Mendocino, just south of Ukiah in the hills, overlooking the Pacific. And single-handedly, dear Pamela has created a garden now in excess of 2.5 acres, digging all of her own paths, lugging stones, digging holes, planting roses, hauling hoses around to water. An amazing gal. On top of all that, she, as one of the friends, at one point said to me, you know, Gregg, as she was walking around the pot ghetto, you know, Gregg, that whole section of pots, you know, it was like this whole section of people right here, they're all ramblers, and they don't really like to be in 5-gallon cans. I said, well, I'll tell you what, you take them and plant them in your garden. She said, done, I'll do it. So over the past 5 years, she has planted about 300 old rambling roses on an 1.5 acre parcel on a hillside. And she can only take care of so much. And the whole purpose of this planting is that the ramblers are never touched. You plant them, you give them some amendments in the beginning, and then you water them through the first 2 or 3 summers, and they're on their own. And they grow into giant haystacks, and they do their once-a-year bloom. But it's more than once a year, because the range of this collection of ramblers covers from April until July. So things will be blooming on that hillside all through that time. If you ever have an opportunity to visit her garden, please do. You'll love it. She generally opens it in late May or early June, and for a charity up in Willits, so usually a medical charity. So all this gathering and bringing friends in, has led us to this crisis where my nursery had to close because it simply didn't have the business that it had had over the years. There are fewer people growing. We are becoming extinct, me with everybody else. And yet there's these roses. I could easily have just said, okay, I can't afford to take care of these, I'm not going to. I was determined that this was something that belonged to everybody. It was a resource that could not go away as long as I had a breath in my body. And so I'm breathing very hard these days to try to keep it going. What's in the balance here? A collection of more than 4,000 varieties of roses, from the very most ancient to very modern roses, with a really large emphasis on older groups. We possess the largest collection of teas and hybrid perpetual roses outside of Europe. and only one other garden has a larger collection of hybrid perpetuals, which is Sangerhausen in Germany. Teas, actually, we probably have the largest tea collection in the world, except for perhaps Australia. The most comprehensive, it's the most comprehensive gathering of old classes, from the Gallicus to the Pernettiana hybrid teas in America. It's an irreplaceable genetic germ bank, and for that reason, we have been approached by the University of California, who are adding to their, there's a germplasm program that is happening on a separate property away from all humanity up in far northern California, where they are keeping the living germ tissue of food crops, particularly fruits and perennial vegetable plants. That's been going on for a number of years. They recently added wine grapes to it, which had not been a part of it, and recently received a new funding, very large grant, to preserve, for the first time, a germplasm of ornamental plants. And they are going to begin with roses, and they have asked if we can provide them with our entire collection for that germplasm bank. You may say to yourself, great, it's all solved. Those roses, no one may ever see them because no one can go into that facility, but at least, my mind's at rest, they'll be saved. Our collection, they are not ready for our budwood and will not be for another 2 or 3 years. And in another year, half of our collection could disappear. And I'll show you why. And finally, this is the only collection in the United States that could restore the Huntington's Old Rose collection, the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, which, by the way, is now gone, and the San Jose Heritage Rose Garden. Brooklyn Botanic has been attacked by, what's it called? Rose Rosette. And they're destroying everything. They have to. It will continue to be a rose garden, but that historic aspect is gone. And also the San Jose Heritage Rose Garden, as I mentioned earlier. So we have this gem, we have this repository that is really important to anyone who loves roses, especially if you think that it's nice that even though I can't go on, maybe a rose that I love can brighten the face of someone 50 years from now. Me in the future is that person. I'm starting to believe in reincarnation. Oops, took it too far. So, yeah. No, thank you. I was just trying to I have to get a look at this, then I'll come back. So, the Friends of Vintage Roses.org, www.thefriendsofvintageroses.org, own this collection of roses. The nonprofit was created for one specific purpose and only one purpose: to preserve this collection of roses. Unlike botanic collections, the Huntington, for example, which is an extremely well-funded botanical garden, however, there is nothing written into anything in the constitution of that entity that says they have to keep any of those plants. A change of leadership in an organization like that makes everything go away if it decides to do so. Monosfont Abbey, the great heritage rose garden in England, designed by Graham Thomas, you'd think that was pretty inviolable in Britain, but the National Trust has been entertaining the possibility of getting rid of the old rose garden and doing something else. We didn't want that to happen to this collection. I and our group don't trust institutions and municipalities to protect anything, not historic buildings, not historic plants. Only you, only individuals who care about a thing actually make it preserved. And that's what this organization does and only does. It owns the collection of roses, It owns the library of rose books that I gathered over 30 years. This is where we stand today in parts of this garden. These are challenges that we face in keeping parts of this collection alive. We don't have enough volunteer time in the garden, and we don't have enough money for the kind of paid help that we would need to keep this from happening. We continue to have setbacks. That's the view from 7 years ago. This was not, oops, sorry about that. This photograph was not taken in the middle of winter, which is what it looks. It was taken in August. That's our collection of historic hybrid teas from 1920 to 1960. We have duplicated these, most of them, but not all. And that's what it used to look like. Many of our roses in the collection are now in containers. We have this huge pot ghetto. The garden is sad in areas, but we do hope that it will come back to something that it once had been. And we need your help. At the very least, which is one of the loveliest things you could do, go to our website, thefriendsofvintageroses.org. See what we're doing. Like us on Facebook. Boy, does that ever help. We have a Facebook page, and all you have to do is go to it if you're on Facebook, The Friends of Vintage Roses. Takes you right there, and just click like. I like that place. That'll show your friends what's going on with us. And lastly, we could use some donations very much. And I thank you very, very much. Yeah, I'll repeat her question. Our goals in preservation include, in a very large part, that the only way to really preserve roses is to make sure that material continues to flow out from the collection so that it's duplicated over and over again. So that's one of our biggest commitments. We're not at a stage yet where we can actually handle that, but we do expect to be at some point. And we are already sharing budwood with the Huntington, and we hope that we will now have completely restored the Huntington's collection of old hybrid teas as a result. Another thing to keep in mind that other collections that we're pushing roses into do have programs where if you become a volunteer, or perhaps you could on occasion go to a plant sale to buy some of the things, some of these rarities. In the future, we do hope to have plant sales to provide some of the real rare things just to the average gardener. Yes? What we hope, and the way we handle that is we do it all freely. If there's a large amount of budwood to be taken, we ask that they take the responsibility for doing that. She's asking if, large gardens like the Huntington that we're helping out with their collection can't, pay in some way. And then I'm writing letters to the head of the Huntington saying, do you like your new rose garden? By the way, here's our website. I think it's a better way to do it. And the important thing is that we want the public to understand that we want this to happen. We don't want any obstacles in the way of getting material out. Thank you very much.